was great, Zizi. Thank you. Let me introduce our panelists. We have Mark Surman, the President of Mozilla, the global nonprofit advocating for more open, equitable internet. Mark has spent 3 decades building a better internet, from the advent of the web to the rise of AI. Mark was the executive director of the Mozilla Foundation for 15 years and also led the creation of Mozilla.ai, a commercial AI R&D lab, and Mozilla Ventures, an impact venture fund with a strong focus on AI. I'll also introduce Nils Gilman. Nils is CEO and Executive Vice President of Programs at the Berggruen Institute, where he directs activities and leads the Institute's research program. Nils also serves as Deputy Editor of Noema magazine, a must-read, by the way. Nils was previously Associate Chancellor at the University of California, Berkeley, and is author of several books, including most recently Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises. Let's start with Mark. Mark, what are you thinking?
So many things. I really liked, I love the whole talk, but that idea of the medicinal use of technology. And I think it's a moment where we have to be on the defense and we have to look at opposition. But it's also really easy in that time to not look at proposition and what is possible. And so I think that idea of the medicinal use is something that kind of is spinning around in my mind around that. And I think you're going to be lucky enough to hear from Audrey tomorrow. And if you haven't read the Plurality book that is out there, what I really like about it is it kind of is about that medicinal use of the technology. And so the idea that we can pick up the tools and shape a reality that maybe not the Chinese model of the economy, the Chinese model of technology, which certainly, if you're the digital minister of Taiwan, has an influence on what you have to build as an alternative, but also as an alternative to the big tech way of using technology, which, as we saw, not that it was a surprise, but from the inauguration photos, is very intertwined with everything else that's going on. And it's really, the thing I often remember is that the big tech companies, certainly the biggest of them, are bigger than the British East India Company, bigger than the Dutch East India Company ever were, either by economic scale or geographic reach. And so, what I think about then, if we go to the medicinal use, is what other aims could we have than sort of global economic domination or authoritarianism, which are really the 2 poles of how we kind of design the core of this AI generation of technology. And maybe I'll just kind of leave that as the question, is what might be the thing we pursue, and what might be some of the practical things we do in addition to opposition to have a proposition for that.
Nils, you bring an interesting historical perspective to these questions and a set of conversations that you've had that may put you in a more pessimistic place.
Yeah, well, things are not. Is this on? Yes. I'm sort of a born contrarian, Gina. In an era when everybody was being super optimistic about technology, I used to try to be pessimistic, and now that everybody's kind of pessimistic, I try to be optimistic. But if we take a historical, I actually want to react with a little bit of a historical reaction to what you were saying, which I totally agreed with the point you were making, Zizi, about how we kind of have come to a very thin understanding of what democracy is. And we tend to think of democracy as being free and fair elections. And I think most people can recognize, I thought you did a really good job of laying out the way in which we want to have a greater engagement around civic engagement and thinking about continuous modes of engagement and so on. And I have some specific things we can get to if we want to talk about specific ideas for how that could work. But I actually just also want to point out how recent that idea that democracy is about free and fair elections is. I mean, I would say that it's really something that comes up in the 1980s. It's which, some of you, or probably most of you in this room just looking around, are probably before you were born, but it's not that long ago. I mean, I remember, I was a teenager, I was there. And I remember actually the moment when the idea that democracy should be defined as free and fair elections I'd put a milestone on that with the National Endowment for Democracy, which was established in 1983. And I think it's probably important to ask, why at that moment was that the definition of democracy that became the dominant one? And I think it has to do with kind of the failure of socialism as a kind of conceptual, as a conceptual apparatus. The idea that the state should be leading the process of economic development specifically. And without getting into rehashing all of the reasons why that failed, there was definitely a sense by the early 1980s that the state should not have a leading role in managing economic development, whether it's in the industrial core or in the global south. And once that idea was abandoned, in the early 1980s, most of Latin America was living under a dictatorship. Obviously, all of Eastern Europe was still living under non-democratic conditions. China, Russia, most of the rest of the world, if you looked at the totality of countries in the world, most countries were not democratic. And then in the course of the 1980s and 1990s, we had what was called the third wave of democratization. And that wave of democratization took place under the notion that democracy should be about free and fair elections. And why was the United States so eager to promote democracy at that point and that definition of democracy? It was because questions of economic justice were taken off the table as a part of democratic practice. Once the governments were taken out of the business of managing the economy, then the leading capitalist country in the world could feel confident promoting the idea that democracy should be about, well, they're not going to determine economic outcomes, they're going to determine cultural outcomes or political outcomes or so on. And the era of neoliberalism, which is now coming to an end, was defined, I think, primarily by the idea that democracy was about free and fair elections to control governments that couldn't control the economy. That era is coming to an end, and the populist uprisings that are happening all over the world, I think, are a reaction from the left and the right to both of those, critiquing both ends of that equation, that democracy should just be about elections, and that, who should have control over the economy. And what's happening in the United States right now is we're having, in the name of a populist revolt, actually we're having a massive corporate takeover of most of the commanding heights of economic decision-making. And I don't know if that's optimistic exactly, but I do think there are ways in which technology could be repurposed in ways through open source platforms and so on, and the kind of work that Audrey has been pioneering in Taiwan to do new kinds of engagement that can get past the kinds of calcifications that took place in the 1980s in our understanding of what democracy is.
Before I bring Zizi back in, I just want to kind of tie a loop around a couple of threads and pull very gently on this idea about the connection between ideologies of what the tech industry could do for the world, right? This kind of notion of the Pax Technica, that trust in big American Silicon Valley tech, and that will spark economic growth. I wrote an essay in January that was published in January that I explicitly call out. It was called "Can Democracy Survive AI?" It's online. You don't have to read it.
We will.
But in it, I explicitly talk about this concept that we're having here in this country of sprinkling AI into public services, and poof, we're going to get magic. We're going to get great. I also have a paper about magic and AI. No plugs. But we're going to get something transformative by simply bringing that tech to this. And in many of these moments, so in the moment of trying to reimagine what a post-industrial U.S. economy would look like, we had the symbolic agents, right? Just go to university, just learn to work with symbolic figures and numbers, and you will unlock this new economy. It will be a new economy. And that's what's going to spark. So we've had this very tight coupling, not only just in terms of thinking about technology and democracy, but technology in economic growth, technology as something that will literally resuscitate aging. But now we need to think about democracies that deliver. And I want to thank, I think it was, sorry, I'm going to get your name wrong, but thank you for putting that phrase, like, how do democracies deliver? How do we think about technologies that help us make the case for why people are connected and what they can, and how have their legend through. And now I want to turn slightly to Zizi to say, just to reflect on what Mark and Nils said, and before we open it up, if you want to question the panel or in other ways.
Thank you. I'll respond to that last bit. How do we get technologies that deliver? By developing them in ways almost opposite to what we've done in the past. We have this fascination with technologies that are able to imitate us. It's almost like a childlike enthusiasm when we're seeing a technology that's able to render some kind of reaction that's familiar because it's human-like. And it's totally understandable. It's a fascination, sense of wonderment with what technology can do. And it's normal that we experience that sometime in our collective past. This process of imitation. But we need to move beyond that because we are creating technologies in our likeness is not necessarily the best way to evolve. I mean, if we think about it rationally, it is impossible to evolve by creating things that are exactly like us. We're replicating our flaws. We're reproducing our biases, and there are many speakers in the audience who can speak to that much more intelligently than I can. So that's one mindset that we need to get out of. The second thing that I want to emphasize is that nearly all AI modalities produce performances of intelligence. Not intelligence, but a performance, a show of intelligence. And I don't mean performance in the way that, in performance studies, Richard Schechner says that, performance is a way of public dreaming, or in self-presentation, sociologists, social psychologists will say, well, all presentations of the self are performative, gender is performative. Not that at all. I mean performance as a show, and also a show-off. And the audience for that show is not you, it's the stock market. So that, that needs to be recognized. And on our end, what we can do again is to reject those technologies that are not cultivated, again, with democracy in mind, but rather with democracy as an afterthought. I think I have one last point that I thought was important when I jotted it down. Yes, it is. We think of technology as a tool. So this is a little bit out there, and forgive me if it is, but what if we just don't think of it as a tool? What if we think about it as art, as music, as something else that's meant to that exists in the environment and that's meant to inspire us and to engage our imagination, but not as a robot that's going to do our laundry, or as an agent that's going to take care of people who live close to us. So I'll stop here.
The agent line reminded me of something that Nils referred to in the prep notes that we had in terms of this imagination of what we think these new technologies might do for us in linking vast parts of our lives together.
Yeah, so some of you may have seen this because it went pretty viral on various platforms. Meredith Whittaker, who most of you probably know, is the head of the head of Signal, was at South by Southwest in Austin earlier this month, and she had a line, or a part of her talk, a clip from it went very viral, and you can find it very easily if you haven't seen it, where she talks about the risks of agentic AI, about the idea that we're going to have agents who can do everything. And the way in which this often gets sold to us, right, is, oh, it's going to be great. You decide, you want to go to the show this weekend and you want to tell all your friends about it. And so you tell the agent to say, oh, go buy me 2 tickets and make sure that I can get the seats that are here. And then tell all my friends that, this group of friends that I wanted them to come too, and invite them all to, and then you can just snap your fingers and it will happen. But what she points out is, in order for that to happen, the agent has to have root access to your messaging apps. It has to have access to your credit cards. It has to have access to your calendar. And all of those things are a risk that, you're eventually going to be giving up not just the power, because you might not mind giving up some amount of autonomy to this agent, but these are actually things that are controlled by third parties, and even if they're not controlled by third parties, they can be hacked. And then once you, as she puts it, break the brain-blood barrier between the OS level and the app level, the chance that something can get hijacked is extremely high. And I think this is a really, a profound risk that Whitaker is pointing out with respect to these kinds of agents. I do think there are ways to mitigate those risks. And I think one of the ways is to break apart the different parts of that equation that require that people intervene at various points in the system, so you don't have a completely automated system. And thinking about democracy in particular and ways we should do it, one thing I've been out hawking, we have a prototype that we've built at the Berggruen Institute of thinking about a political agent that could be able to advocate on your behalf. But two of the things that we have built into that prototype, specifically that are meant to address Meredith's concerns, is, first of all, it should be open source and not controlled by a particular platform. And one concern I have is that if it doesn't get built on open source, it'll get built on a closed source platform. Mark Zuckerberg would like nothing more than to control our political decision making for us. And then the second point is that you want to make sure that people have to intervene in the process, that there have to be approval processes for you to continuously engage. And you can do that in a way that can be potentially fun. You can gamify an engagement model so that people want to engage in politics, right? Reduce the barriers to the kind of continuous engagement that you were describing in your talk with technology, but making sure that people actually use it not to disengage and to outsource their brains, but to actually engage more in a more fun way with lower barriers to entry. So that's sort of what I would say.
And before I open it up to the audience, so that's to cue your questions. Mark, I'm sure you're having many interesting conversations about open source at the moment. Like, you usually have interesting conversations about the open source, but let me throw out one that I've been hearing here in the UK. I've literally heard this in pretty much every meeting over the last 2 weeks. No one trusts the American stack. We may be seeing the dismantling of global big tech because of Trump and Musk. Thoughts?
Very optimistic. And I would say, even before the last 3 months, part of what we've been trying to figure out, with lots of our friends and partners, people like Audrey, is how do we build a different stack? I think of it as a third-way stack, a pluralism stack, a public AI stack. And that's the workshop we'll do today is really actually us asking for advice for how can Mozilla be helpful in that. And a key opportunity in this setting, like if we kind of just take it even, imagine that reality is real and we're not in the reality distortion field that we're in right now. You have a lot of countries, I'm Canadian, we certainly feel this right now, saying like, what's the economy we're gonna be in? Where's my independence and survivability as an economy gonna come from in this setting? And in terms of the digital pieces of the economy, no country other than the US with big tech and China can really afford to build a digital economy on its own that is an alternative or that is that dismantling. And so really this idea we're exploring is sort of sovereignty through collaboration. And the idea that open source really is the lingua franca that you need for that. And this actually comes from the big tech playbook, which is if what you want to do is advance your own cause, make the plumbing cheap, make the plumbing interoperable. And Meredith has another paper attacking or critiquing open source as being under kind of corporate capture. And a lot of it is, I would rather have technology that is under the corporate capture and not governed by any single one of them, which Linux is. But also we can imagine something where the resources we spend as the British government or the Canadian government or a British startup or a Canadian nonprofit or anywhere accrue to something bigger that is under our common control, or at least under no one's control. And there's problems with that. There's lots of problems with open source. There's lots of risks with open source. But I do think that the economic isolationism and economic kind of self-preservation some set of people will need to cluster around a third stack. And certainly our proposition is that that is a pluralistic and open source stack, and that there's benefit for people in that. But if you have ideas on how to do that, come to our session.
And I'm sure people in the audience have ideas and thoughts. We have about 20 minutes for our discussion. Who wants to kick us off?
Sophia Adams-Barty, I'm an independent researcher and consultant in the field. I recently published a report with Justice, the human rights organization, which some of you will be familiar with, and it anchors around this idea of really having clarity around purpose, the purpose of AI in that context to drive the outcomes that we want from the justice system. And I feel, Nils, you really provoked a thought, which is if indeed governments have, over the last 20, 30 years or so, vacated the curating of our economic model, how do you drive back into the economic model that sense of purpose, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, but a clarity of responsibility? And there's been quite a lot of work on this idea of the future of the corporation. Colin Mayer and others at the British Academy have done work in the past. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on how we can back that in. Maybe it is through the third stack, Mark, that would be really interesting. But also your degrees of optimism, because the challenge is not without really quite considerable, determined efforts to stop it.
Great. And before we jump to Nils for that, let's get Clemmy's question as well. Clemmy, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Clementine Collett. I'm a research fellow at the Minderoo Centre, and I work on AI and copyright. And I'd thank you so much for the panel and your talk, Zizi. I just wanted to pick up on your point about AI as a tool, and instead looking at it as creative. I guess my question is around how we square that with the current debate that's going on about whether AI can be creative and how it's also using creatives' data. Obviously, last week it was released, the LibGen data set, of which one of my novels is on the data set, and has been used to train Meta's large language model, Llama. And obviously then OpenAI's story about grief that came out in The Guardian last week as well. So yeah, we'd just love to hear a bit more about what you think about how AI can be creative and how we square that with the current debate on AI and creativity and creative industries.
And while Zizi's collecting her thoughts, who's our next two questions? We've got Mutali down here and Sarah. Let's get the mics. Nils.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that is something I've gotten much more pessimistic about in the last 3 months or 6 months, depending on how you count it, at least for the United States. So I guess I would say a couple of different things. I think that there was a moment, an ambitious moment in the United States in particular, which is the place I've spent the most time looking at this, under the Biden administration, for an idea for a new kind of industrial policy. And I wrote a paper a few years ago now that I thought that there was really an opportunity for a new mode of industrial policy that would hopefully avoid some of the challenges that industrial policy had faced during the 30 years after the end of the Second World War, and they could do things in a much more effective way. And I was particularly focused there on sort of green technology transitions and so on, more than thinking about the AI issues that is the focus of this conference. The problem, obviously, right now is that, and the problem even during the Biden administration, was a lack of state capacity to actually manage those kinds of projects. I'm living these days in France, which is a country that's maintained much more of that capacity for state planning than most other Western democracies. Even they struggle, relatively speaking, the kinds of ambitious projects that France pulled off regarding nuclear power and the TGV and so on in the heyday of dirigisme, as it came to be called, I think has gone away. But you look at the country that's most effective at this in the world today, it's obviously China. I mean, the amount of state capacity that China has for planning is really astounding. And you can look at it, I mean, I don't know how many of you have been to China recently, but it's instructive to go on a trip from Europe to go spend some time in Shenzhen or Shanghai, and then to fly to the United States and just see how differently things are organized in these three major cores. And it's just astounding how much more effective they are. And your mileage may vary about how you feel about China winning the competition, but clearly right now they have the capacity to do state planning in a way that doesn't exist on either side of the Atlantic right now. But that doesn't mean that capacity can't be rebuilt. And I do think that there are opportunities for that. The challenge fundamentally, I think, if I was going to put a fine bow on it, is where do you worry about the corruption taking place? So there's one kind of corruption that can take place if you don't have any state regulatory agencies. Then you see all kinds of looting and corruptions and scamming and so on. And that's basically the economy of the United States has been in, arguably, but certainly is going to be amplifying up over the next 4 or however many years this current government is, or this current regime is in power. There's another kind of corruption that comes with having a high state capacity that then becomes a point of capture. And that's exactly the thing that I think Xi Jinping has been trying to combat with the anti-corruption campaigns that he's been having. And that's the classic critique of de-regisme, right? I mean, this is the Buchananite public interest theory idea that, like, basically bureaucrats are self-dealing in their fundamental motivations. I think that that's an excessively cynical view. I think if you look historically, there's been places where you had actually elites behaving in probative ways. And what we really need to do is study why do we end up with regimes sometimes where we have elites that are pretty good at doing planning and pretty non-corrupt. And most of the examples we have in the West these days are small countries, places like Denmark or Singapore or Switzerland. Those are still pretty high capacity countries. They're small, and that might be an indicator. But at least 2 of those are actually quite diverse places. So I don't think the diversity argument is necessarily one that can throw against it. I'll stop there.
Mark, why don't you jump in on this?
Yeah, I want to touch a little bit on both of those, and I'll try to be brief. But I think as you look at the U.S. and feel pessimistic about that, and as we just yesterday in Canada went into an election, I feel quite optimistic.
Okay.
In that the economic pressures that I'm talking about as U.S. isolationism grows, as you look to the China model, are like, we're going, I mean, it's astounding. From Mike Myers going on Saturday Night Live with his elbows up, which maybe Canadians don't know, but it's like, we're going to fight back like hockey players. There is a real desire that I have never seen in my life. Like the tone going into our election is, we are at economic war, and we need to galvanize this country to fight it, since we haven't fought like World War II. And I think that actually may lead to a different shift. I mean, it's interesting that the person who's the current prime minister and in my mind hopefully will win, Mark Carney, is an economist, and I think looks at wielding the state in exactly that way. And when you see, in an AI summit, which very little was good that came out of the AI summit in Paris, but one of the things that did is where the Americans and the British said, we're just not going to play, the Europeans said, we're going to build an Airbus for AI, we're going to build a CERN for AI, and a nod to collaborative industrial policy in the digital setting. So I actually think if we lean into some of those things in the current moment, there is a chance to kind of head in a different direction. And copyright is a tough one. Probably nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. The thing I will just say, and the creativity of AI is probably too long for this and not my thing, but on the copyright and the use of creative works, one of the things that I really am watching is whether and how, and certainly we know some of these people who think there is a whether and how, we get beyond what feels like a false dichotomy between progress on AI and theft. And so the idea, in the same way that it was, unless you have billions of dollars for data centers, you can't train base models to grow in performance. And whether you believe the DeepSeek hype or not, there is some level or some set of techniques that got them to be able to train something cheaper. Lots of other people are working on that. We will see things be trained cheaper and cheaper. I think in the same way that the case is made, we can't have AI performance without taking copyrighted works, like that's the only way to compete. There are people who are arguing and building ethical data sets. We worked with Eleuthera.ai, Creative Commons, and a bunch of others on a paper this summer about this, building ethical data sets that actually can also train performance AI. And I think that's a really important place to look. And I also think it's a place for the open source world and the creative industries to work together to look at how we actually just break that false dichotomy that is there and create AI that is performant and copyright respecting and ethical, I do think it's possible. We need to put our attention there.
I'm actually okay and quite happy with the United States losing the position of dominance that they've had and held for some time in the technology sector. You know, we have people in the United States that start these companies and run them before they've actually graduated college, and that's something that we celebrate as a society. You know, we say, look, you know, they left college to develop this company, and that's problematic. You know, they don't have what they needed, the body of knowledge they needed to develop. That we also celebrate technologies constantly being in flux and changing and launching these half-finished versions of platforms. Gina, you've written extensively about that. Technologies being in permanently beta form. This is not okay. I've traveled to China. I am inspired. I'm not saying those models are perfect either, but I'm inspired by a lot of the different approaches to the same kinds of questions and needs that we have for technology. The copyright and the creative industry problems is an old one that's been with us for some time now. It's complex because, you know, we're dealing with global terrain and technologies that operate globally, and then they also have to function and be and align with local legal mentalities. So that's problem number one. That's obstacle number one. But obstacle number two, I think the more serious obstacle is that the law tends to be quite conservative, and the dominant approach is to take legal solutions that worked in the past and just kind of try to rearrange them and patch them up and serve them up to, offer, again, a half-finished, very immediate response. We should be rethinking the law and creating law that's specific to what we're seeing. And that, you know, there's some wonderful people doing work like that. The one that comes to mind right now is Frank Pasquale, who works on that, also works on affective computing, and we'll see the need. We already see a pronounced need for that now. But even within the academic world and law, there's resistance to that modality of change. But again, I think we have to persevere. We have to be patient, and we have to keep moving in that direction. You know, change is going to be gradual, but we have to keep pushing for those newer ways of understanding and developing, again, new frameworks, new legal frameworks for new technologies.
I'm going to bring Mutali into the conversation.
Hello, does this work? Oh. Hi, my name is Mitali Nkonde. I run a nonprofit called AI for the People, and I'm also a PhD student here where I'm looking at online radicalization of racialized people globally. And one of the things that really struck me was your comment around micro-governance. So as well as all of those things, I'm a New Yorker, and one of the things that we have in New York City, pray for us, a lot is going wrong in New York City right now. One of the things that we have in New York City is participatory government. So we will come together, there will be budget assigned, and in our council district. So this idea of it's literally your neighbors. Most of it is analog. And the reason that it's analog is that I also live in a very diverse neighborhood where people do not trust technologies. They would rather have things that are written down. They would rather have your neighbors knock on your door. And my question is really about trust, because I'm very inspired because of the work I do of this idea that AI systems could deliver this type of micro-governance. But building on Nils's point and Whitaker's points, what does it actually mean to give that information over? And then on top of that, open source, the stack. These things mean nothing to my neighbors who will show up and we will decide that we want $1 million to our local library because we think we need more books. So I'd love for you to speak more about kind of what that would look like. And the other thing I'd add is civic information, is civic education also AI education around what these systems can actually do and not do?
Great. And let's bring Sarah into the conversation.
Hi there. Am I on? This is Sarah Roberts from UCLA. I think there were two comments in the talk and in the response that were sort of supreme importance, and I want to kind of link them up. So the first thing that I think we should probably return to is the point that Zizi made about the use of open signifiers and sort of meaninglessness of terminology that is capacious enough for people to fill it in with whatever they want it to be. And I would submit that AI is such a term, right? It's, if anything, the way that most of us interact with it in our professional lives, although we think we're in, and we may be doing technical work around it, we're actually doing political and rhetorical work. And I think that once we kind of can accept that, which is, you know, requires a profound shift, right? Then we can go to this point, this historical point of an impoverished form of democracy that has been completely excised from a relationship to an economy and any power over the economy. And it seems like, in a way, our focus on AI and our consternation or our support or our optimism or pessimism really is causing us to miss the forest for the trees in so many ways. And I include myself in this, right? I'm implicated. But in fact, we need to actually address what that is pasting over, which is a totally reductionist concept of democracy. And so I just, you know, for no particular reason, I've been rewatching The Battle of Chile, okay? And which is about the CIA-backed coup in Chile that installed Pinochet in the early 70s. And the whole point of that was to wrest control of the maybe aspirational computerized digital management of the state economy back into the hands of private corporations. And so in a way, I feel like we're coming from this perspective of meaningless AI and this, if we concur that we don't have any power over the economy, they're kind of coming together at this meeting point, and we're over here talking about other things. So I wonder if you feel like, you know, all of us in some ways need to reframe our emphasis on the instrumentalization of AI, which is important, but also trying to think about its use to distract and be almost a meaningless rhetorical tool, to return to your point. Just want to know what you think about, are we doing the right thing even? So I'll leave it there.
There's a lot on the table. Who wants to take the first step? Nils.
I have maybe a couple of things to say about both your comments. So first of all, the question of trust in technology, you tried to, Sarah, link up these comments that Zizi and I were making. I want to link up these two comments also, because I think that the floating signifier nature of AI is part of the lack of trust. Like, people can project a lot, you know, it becomes almost a projection screen for their fears of technology. I'm not going to pretend, this is not really my field at all, so I'm not going to pretend to have an answer for what should be done about this. But I think you're putting your finger on a really important problem. I will say that in many of those kinds of communities, somebody who looks like me and walks in and starts talking about things is probably not going to be the most effective messenger for something like that. I do think that community engagement, I mean, the fact is we all incorporate technology. Even people who think that they are distrustful of technology, they incorporate, you know, they ride the MTA and they get on buses and they have cell phones and they use the microwave. And these are all technologies that when they immediately came out were also objects of floating signification and people having concerns about what they were going to be. And yet people integrated some of them. I think the way AI has been discussed, even including the way we're discussing it here, it can seem like a really elite thing that's being imposed from above and that you don't have any control and therefore it's something you want to retreat from. And I do think that we want to think about ways in which we can make it less of a scary and alienating thing. The problem is that it's empirically a scary and alienating thing right now, right? So like, you just can't tell people, oh, don't be scared and alienated, because it's their right to be scared and alienated. So we need to have alternatives for the actual technology so that people will want to engage. And again, this is, you know, we keep pointing to Audrey here, and there's a reason for that, right? But you know, the things that Mozilla has been doing, the things that Signal has been doing that make people feel more confident about doing messaging, feel more confident about surfing the internet in a way that's going to guard people's privacies. These are all tools that I think can help people get through those kinds of concerns. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to link them. This is I want to have this conversation all day long. I think that it's absolutely the case that you have this floating signifier problem and we kind of need to put our sights elsewhere. I guess one of the things I worry is that we do take our sights off the technology, though, and the political economy of the technology, because we are seeing yet another wave of changing the fabric of our economy that we've seen with the internet over the last 30 years. And paying attention to how that fabric operates and the rules of engagement does matter. And so that isn't, there's something going on in terms of a very different, and Mozilla's actually stuck in this, right? We come from an era of open source where it's like, don't ever touch data because that's the way you're gonna protect privacy. When the whole fabric of computing is made by data, you can't take a principled position from there. You have to say how you either disengage or you figure out how do we want this era of computing to work differently. And it is important to A, engage with that in my view, and B, believe we can change the assumptions of it. And then that is a very rarefied conversation. Like, as you say, Natalie, like open source, open schmorse, like, nobody knows. And like that is both kind of unimportant and the most important thing at the same time. And the reason I say that is because I think it's very important. But if you think about, with all of its many, many problems, the language diversity in Wikipedia, you have a really interesting kind of dual kind of set of players in that you have people who have got access to certain kinds of knowledge in their own language, and as people increasingly have smartphones, that didn't exist, in the same way before, or at least weren't erased. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of difficult work ahead still at Wikipedia to have things not be erased. But most people don't really have anything to do with or know about the Wikipedia editor community that makes that possible. And so I think there is a really incredible, important piece of work to figure out who is that Wikipedia editor community broadly cast for the diversity and democratization of this technology. And it's very hard. It's not done. It's also under attack through this wave of things. But it is actually a really interesting organizing phenomena. If you look at that, to the people who read, Wikipedia in a language that, there isn't a lot of other centralized internet content, they don't need to know that there is this weird open source community behind it. And I think we need to kind of figure out how to do some of that to address what you're talking about, Natalie.
And Zizi, we're going to give you a last word.
I want to give a more specific response to your question. So when I was speaking with my conversational companions and I was having trouble getting them to speak about what might democracy look like, otherwise I would frequently ask, well, where did you find inspiration, or give me an example where you saw democracy at work, and they brought up community organizations and their involvement with those. So my proposal in the book is that we don't work digitally through those. We work analog. We use analog means, and we train a whole new class of professionals and offer degrees for people who are trained to become conversational interlocutors, governmental interveners, so that we replace that meso level of communication that's been broken, that was meant to be served by the media, but the media have been commercialized. So there's this gap between the micro level and the macro level. And that then we at universities train these professionals so that we're not churning out all these people who are, naturally coming to us post-pandemic to become engineers and economic analysts because they think that's where the money is and the market's not going to be able to absorb them. Regarding the floating or the open signifier and AI, I would say, Jeremy Bailenson has said something interesting, similar regarding the development of the metaverse and virtual reality. We have to ask questions, is it necessary to develop AI for that? And is it doing something in ways better than we had before? And if not, reject it and do something other.
And on this cheery note, I want you to join me in thanking our panel.